I am Elena Volpi. I direct the City Center on Aging, and I welcome for the second of our 5 talks of the 22nd annual Lefeber Winter Series on Aging. So today we are very lucky to have Dr. Michael Marsiske here with us to talk about cognitive function, which is something all of us want to know about and whether we can improve that, right? So Dr. Marsiske is an associate professor with tenure in the Department of Clinical and Health Psychology in the College of Health Professions at the University of Florida in Gainesville. He's also the associate chair for research in the same department. He holds a joint appointment in the Department of Psychology in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and is the training director of the University of Florida NIA-funded pre-doctoral training program, a T32, on physical, cognitive, and mental health in social context. For a period from 2005 to 2013, he served as the leader of the recruitment, retention, and adherence core of the Pepper Center, which is at the University of Florida. And then he became the core leader of the data management and analysis core of the NIA-funded Florida Alzheimer's Disease Center. Dr. Marsiske received his bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Toronto, and then he went to the Pennsylvania State University, where he received a master's degree and a PhD from the Department of Human Development and Family Studies, where he also received was funded by National Institute on Aging pre-doctoral training in the Gerontology Center. Dr. Marsiske received a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship from the Center for Psychology and Human Development of the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Germany. Prior to going to the University of Florida, Dr. Marsiske was an assistant professor in the Institute of Gerontology and the Department of Psychology at Owens State University, and then from the year 2000 on has been at University of Florida working on his research and teaching. He served also as the University of Florida Institute on Aging Associate Director for Research and also as an interim director of that institute. He has been funded continuously by federal grants for the past more than 20 years. And he's published over 88 peer-reviewed publications. Dr. Marsiske is a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America and is the past recipient of the Springer Award for Early Career Achievement in Research in Adult Development and Aging from the American Psychological Association. He's the past chair of the NIA Behavior and Social Sciences Initial Review Committee, which is a study section of the National Institute on Aging, and has served as in the editorial boards of the journals Gerontology, Psychological Sciences, and in the Aging Neuropsychology and Cognition. So please join me to welcome Dr. Marsiske, who's going to give a talk about his most recent research.
It's a privilege, of course, when you're in academia that sometimes you get to visit other places, and I have been extremely privileged this last couple of days to learn about Galveston, to learn about UTMB, to learn about the really fascinating ways in which you put different units together in the service of studying aging. And I feel enriched, and I think there are a couple of ideas I'll steal and take back to Florida. So thank you very much for having me. What I'm going to talk about today is the merits of late-life cognitive training. And what I'm going to try to tell you is that this is an area of research that's been very productive and active for several decades, that there are some controversies associated with it, really with regard to the real-world value of such training, and to suggest some evolutions in the field and some suggestions for evolution in the field that I think will help strengthen it in the future. It's true of all of us here that we're never the product of our own efforts, but we'd be nowhere without the support of colleagues, students, and funding agencies. And what you see here are some of the many organizations and the people in those organizations who've helped produce a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So The premise of my talk today is that initially research on cognitive training with older adults really started as a proof of concept, really to address a question about whether, in fact, you could teach old dogs new tricks. And it existed to challenge the notion of irreversible decline in the information processing abilities of older adults. That was the original rationale for the research. And over time, as there accrued strong evidence that such interventions could be quite durable, the question shifted to, can this training matter? Could we, for example, boost independence and well-being in older adults by means of cognitive training? And along the way, there have been some missteps. So today I'm going to try to focus on these 5 questions to frame a story moving forward. First, give a sense of with whom we're intervening and why this is a growing area of interest, what are some of the historical findings, and then what's the controversy. I'm going to focus specifically on a concept called transfer of training, which is really the critical concept for training to have real-world impact, and then I'm going to think a little bit about the way forward. So first, with whom are we intervening? The thing to understand is that to date, most cognitive training research has focused on a group of people free of cognitive impairment, what we typically refer to as healthy, community-dwelling older adults. So even though there's a critical need to think about things that we might be able to do in some of these later stages of cognition, it's fair to say that most of the cognitive training research today has had more of a prevention mindset rather than a rehabilitation mindset. And that's largely the population that I'm going to talk about today. And most of you know this, but in general, when we look at lifespan studies of cognitive aging, the trajectories have been described by some as the dual-face story of aging. While from the upper left to the lower right, you see all kinds of things that seem to go progressively down. These are things that we think of as memory, working memory, attention, processing speed. There are also some domains, the ones in orange and amber, that seem to stay stable or even increase throughout the lifespan. These are the kinds of bodies of knowledge that we accrue professionally and through education. Vocabulary is a great example. The words we know tend to continue to accrue throughout the healthy lifespan. So it's in this dual face of aging that most interventions have concerned themselves with the things that go down, right? What we call the age-sensitive or age-vulnerable aspects of cognition, because those are the things that we'd like to shore up if we could. So this is a complex figure, but there's really a very simple take-home message. You can think of these 4 different lines as 4 possible stories of cognitive aging. And the gray envelope constitutes the range of possibilities for people through a variety of genetic and lifestyle factors and also through environmental issues. So let's first of all focus on the yellow line, person D. That's the person we least want to be like, right? They start low and they go low, low, low. And at some point here in the 70s, they cross a line that's scarily called functional threshold. Their level of cognition has dipped below some level beyond which it can support effective everyday functioning. But then take a look at the red person, A. That's the person we might all like to be, where the period really throughout what we might call up to and beyond retirement age is characterized by steady gain and slow increase. And after which there is a decline, but it's in the nature of how high they start that they don't cross the functional threshold, if ever, until after age 100, and probably they predecease the crossing of the functional threshold. That's sort of how we all want to be. So cognitive intervention is, in principle, something that should move people higher up within this envelope. And the prototypical line is the green one, C. So you'll notice that person C was on a decline trajectory, and then something happened, I don't know, in the 60s, that seems to have flattened out the curve, so that once decline begins again, it begins from a delayed baseline, from a place that decline was slowed for a time, and then it resumed. And that's what we hope to do with cognitive intervention. It's to introduce a shock to the system that slows for a time, the period of decline. Decline is sort of inevitable. There's a set of biological factors, some of us more than others, but perhaps if we can decline from a higher baseline, we can postpone the crossing of this functional threshold. So that's sort of the premise of what cognitive training is meant to do. So there has been enormous growth in interest in cognitive training research. This, for example, is a newspaper clipping from USA Today in 2005, and it's when I started to really record what was happening, and there was more and more press about interest in things that people can do to maintain a sharp mind for golden years. And very often these studies, these newspaper articles reference, for example, the growing of the baby boomer cohort and a desire in that cohort to do proactive things to maintain health up to and including cognitive health. Well, if that's true, then it suggests that there's a substantial market interested in ways to keep the brain sharp. The problem is that market, in some ways, had needs that outstripped the available empirical data. So by 2010, for example, as game systems proliferated in people's homes and also these portable devices, this is just a partial list of just some of the commercial products that were available that marketed themselves as approaches for maintaining sharp brains. A problem is that with maybe one or two exceptions, almost none of these had any empirical support, and to the extent that they had empirical support, that support was that you could boost particular things that you train, but nothing to do with dementia. But I remember around this time I saw a television commercial for a Nintendo product called Brain Age. And it was a mortifying sort of scenario with a husband walking with his wife on the street, middle-aged, and he ran into a colleague. And he couldn't remember the colleague's name, and he was mortified, right? So what does he do? He buys Nintendo Brain Age. And at the end of the commercial, he runs into a colleague on the street, and he can introduce that colleague. The problem is there is nothing in Nintendo Brain Age that teaches face name memory. There's absolutely no reason to believe that someone who spends a lot of time on that device is going to improve their face name memory. Face name memory is a very specific, very trainable thing, but it wasn't covered in Brain Age. And this began a tradition, I would say, of excessive claims in advertising that, as you'll see, has culminated in some fairly dramatic consequences. So many of these brain training programs then were not stimulated by research, but really by the emergence of a computer-savvy baby boomer market that was looking for things, and coupled with the technological change, that suddenly it was possible to deliver these things over game systems, portable devices, and the web. But marketing outstrips research. So before I sort of go into the problem of this, I want to just first give you a sense of what the historical findings up to the present have been about how cognitive training really works. Okay? So you have to understand that cognitive training research really emerged in about the 1970s, and it was focused on what I label here Trend 3, which was modifying age differences. And honestly, when you read some of the earliest papers proposing that we should do cognitive training with older adults, they reference things like the women's liberation movement and the awareness of human potential in the civil rights movement as suggesting that we can challenge the given. And that in that context of challenging the given, we should challenge the question of whether age-related decline is fixed and immutable or whether we can do something about it. So the earliest cognitive training studies were really designed to assess the question of whether cognitive decline was in fact irreversible or whether we could reverse it. And that was the only question. As research grew to suggest that yes, performance could be improved in older adults, we began to see the emergence of a new literature on the modifiability of cognitive performance that was aimed at expanding the definition to understanding whether, for example, certain kinds of cognitive training might improve everyday functioning. And it was the earliest research on cognitive training, which has continued to sort of dominate the way we think about it, has focused on three major foci, one called reasoning, one called memory, and one broadly defined as attention or speed of processing. Now, there are many, many different variants of cognitive abilities that have been studied under each of these headings, but I'm just going to focus on three specific ones to give you a concrete feeling for what it is we've been training. So, reasoning, for example, consists of the ability to identify patterns in abstract and novel stimuli. So here's a very simple example. It's called a matrix reasoning test. It's included in every test of intelligence. And what you have to do is figure out what goes in the box with the question marks. And of course, what you have to do is figure out the pattern goes from 1 to 2 and from white to black. Therefore, what should fill that last square is 2 black circles. Right? And what we do is we ever increase the difficulty, the size of the matrix, the amount of information people have. And the thinking is that you're training abstract reasoning skills that go beyond dots and blocks to more basic pattern identification skills. Another kind of reasoning that has been trained, it shows very negative relationships with aging, but it's very trainable, is called inductive reasoning. So here you have a series of letters. This is, again, one of the simplest examples. A-M-B, A-N-B, A-O-B, A. What comes next? What comes next? P, right. A couple of people were afraid to say, but it's P. And this is, again, something that, especially as the series get more and more complex, people have difficulty with. The way I said this series is part of the way that we train it. There's a rhythm there, a rhythmicity, and we try to help people to hear it and see it because that helps them make the patterns explicit. And this is something then that many studies now have shown is quite trainable and also quite related to performance on certain kinds of everyday tasks like filling out tax forms or identifying critical information in a medication chart or a bus schedule. So memory, you all know what memory is. Obviously, one of the most common ways memory's been studied is through verbal list recall. Lots of other ways. But verbal list recall is an area where, again, we think it has functional relevance. Performance on tasks like this are highly predictive of memory impairment. But it's also quite easy to teach people strategies like organization, visualization, association that can make remembering long lists of words like this much easier. Some memory training studies have trained through a method called the method of loci from ancient Greece, actually, have trained older adults to remember as many as 30 or 60 rows of words in perfect order. So these are quite usable with older adults. Attention and speed of processing has many, many definitions, but the one that we'll consider today, because it's relevant to a lot of current research, is the useful field of view. So useful field of view sounds like a sensory perceptual skill, but in fact it's actually a habit of attention. What many studies have shown is that with age there's a restriction of the field of view, not for visual reason, but for attentional reasons. We become increasingly focused on the center of view. Well, you can imagine if that's true, that can put you at risk for things that require attention to the broader visual display, mobility impairment, falls, driving, and so forth. So the useful field of view training is one that tries to train people to take more information in a glance, to ever expand the field of view, and to accurately attend to more and more information in a broader field of view. We do this by means of, this is an older model, but this is a very effective way of training, by presenting people with displays where they have to identify what's in the center of a display. This is supposed to be a car. The truck looks equally pixelated. And then they're also supposed to identify the location of a peripheral object. Here it's at about 4 o'clock. And it turns out that you can ever speed this up down to as fast as 16 milliseconds, which is fast. Make them have to identify both things within 16 milliseconds. You fill the screen with clutter like these triangles, and you can move the peripheral object out, and older adults become increasingly proficient at doing this with practice. And as soon as they get good at one level, you make it harder. So the typical intervention study is a classic clinical trial design. You have a baseline assessment. You randomize people to receive training or no training, typically. There hasn't been a lot of work historically with placebo controls, and that's a problem. I'll come back to that. And then you follow people up immediately and usually for some delayed interval, but that delayed interval has ranged anywhere from 1 week to 7 years or 10 years. So in a nutshell, what this corpus of studies showed was that training with older adults worked. So yes, old dogs learn new tricks. Reasoning gains were strong for those more methodologically inclined, about a half a standard deviation or more improvement than untrained controls, and that's generally considered a moderate effect size. And these gains lasted up to 7 years. Memory training worked well with older adults, interestingly, especially when done in small group settings, so that they could, older adults could help themselves with peer recommendations. This is what worked for me. This is what worked for me. But there's less evidence that memory training is durable. So even studies that followed for up to 2 years tended to find that the benefits of memory training were already gone. And then useful field of view training has been shown to be extremely strong. Sizable effect sizes, almost double what's been reported for reasoning, durable for several years, and perhaps most interestingly, evidence that people who improved as a function of useful field of view training also improved on tasks like self-reported and simulated driving. And that's the baseline from which the modern era of cognitive training research sort of took off. In 1996, the National Institute on Aging and the National Institute for Nursing Research made their first call for a behavioral clinical trial that was designed to use cognitive training with older adults in a standard clinical trial protocol, which meant multiple sites, many people at each site. And the trial was to focus on a primary outcome that wasn't cognition, but that was functional competence, how well people could perform tasks of daily living. Now, we'll see in a minute, that was a bit of a stretch, but that was the goal of the request for application. The resulting active clinical trial differed from prior cognitive training research in several ways: multi-site, randomized, controlled, single-blind trial. The analytical approach was intent to treat. All that means is people had to be considered and analyzed whether they were compliant with the interventions or not. That makes it a better real-world test. It includes primary outcome measures of everyday functioning, and the sample was more socioeconomically and racially diverse than in prior intervention studies. About a quarter of a sample, for example, was African American. The study was funded at 6 field sites around the country, along with a coordinating center, and we began what became a 15-year labor of love to collect 10 years of data from all of our participants. The conceptual model then of the active study was that we would, let me just remember how I do it, there we go, was that we would train people with the expectation that training would directly improve cognitive abilities, but that there may be generalization to some kind of daily function, which I've been vague about so far. Our final sample ended up consisting of almost 3,000 older adults, 76% female, with an average age of about 74 years, 27% of whom were non-white. And this won't mean something to all of you, but the mini mental status exam is one that's widely used as a very crude screening tool for the possible presence of dementia. We restricted enrollment in the study to people aged, with scores of 23 to the maximum, 30. So we tried to rule out what you might consider frank dementia. And as you can see, it was a very, in that regard, positively biased sample, with most people doing extremely well, but a substantial proportion of people doing in what you might consider the low normal range. Relative to the United States population at that time, in the US Census, this is sort of the age pyramid for adults between 65 and 90 when we enrolled in 98. And then this is the distribution of participants in active. And the short summary is that we did a pretty good job of representing the census, except that we slightly overrepresented the young old and we underrepresented the old. And that's sort of a thing to note, that the very oldest people are probably a little bit underrepresented in this study. And the general design of the study, it looks complex, but it's very simple, actually. After baseline measurements, we randomized people into one of four groups. They either got memory training, reasoning training, speed of processing training, which is this useful field of view, or no contact. And then after training, we followed them up pretty much annually, and then we started to take bigger breaks through a 10-year follow-up. And briefly to note that a subset of people were randomized to receive a little bit of extra training. And what I mean by a little bit of extra training is that these people got about 10 hours of training, and people who were randomized into booster got over the next 3 years about another 8 hours of training. So the minimum training dosage was about 10 hours. The maximum training dosage was about 18 hours over 3 years. So this figure is one of three I'm going to show you, and although it looks complex, it's very simple. So this is the outcome speed of processing, the useful field of view. And what you see here are the 10-year curves for three groups of people. The gold line here is the group of people who received speed of processing training, and the other lines are the three groups of people who received either training in something else, memory or reasoning, or no training at all. And the take-home message here was that on the speed of processing target of training, people who received this training experienced a substantial improvement and then maintained their benefit over untrained subjects all the way through the 10-year follow-up. Now, two other things are true. There's normative age-related decline going on, and the size of the benefit is shrinking as time goes on. But it's still surprising to the investigators and others that even 10 years after training, we would still see this magnitude of difference between people who received training and people who didn't. That really means, literally, think about it, that in 1998 or 2000, you got 10 hours of training, and we still see effects in 2010. Okay, that was surprising, and it wasn't just restricted to speed of processing. In somewhat less dramatic fashion, we saw something similar for the reasoning training. Now the green group are the people who got training in reasoning, and on the reasoning outcome, you see a similar pattern, if not as dramatic. That is to say, initial gain, and then relative maintenance of that gain with slow dissipation of the effect as time goes on. But nonetheless, a detectable benefit even 10 years after training, and a more sizable benefit 3 and 5 years after training. Memory, as previewed by the prior literature, was somewhat less dramatic, but what you still see in memory, this is now the memory-trained group in gray, and relative to the other three groups, they show an initial performance advantage in memory, and then they maintain that performance advantage, in this case actually pretty undissipated, through about 5 years after training. But by 10 years after training, their benefit has washed out for the most part. But nonetheless, then, the take-home is that on the target of training, people get better and stay at least somewhat better on average 10 years later. But the other hidden message here is that you'll see how specific the training effects were. In other words, the memory-trained people got better on memory, but not reasoning and speed. The speed-trained people got better on speed, but not memory and reasoning. And that plays out into today's story. Yes?
Were there meaningful differences between those who got the 10 hours versus...
Sorry, I've got to come closer.
Were there meaningful differences between those who got the 10 hours versus 18 hours?
No, they were randomly assigned. So the question is, were there meaningful differences between people assigned to receive 10 hours versus assigned to receive 18 hours? In general, no. The assignment to a little or a lot was randomly done, with one small exception, which is that people who didn't attend the initial training, who didn't get the first 10 hours, they were non-compliant, they weren't eligible then to get the booster 8 hours, because the booster 8 hours were premised on having the first 10 hours. But we had a really small proportion, probably less than 5% of a sample that was non-compliant. So basically,
Training over the range of 10 to 18 made no difference?
no. So there was, now, if you're asking, was there an additional benefit of booster training? Yes, there was. So I didn't want to go into all that today, but yes, so that's another really interesting story, in that in all three interventions, getting 18 hours of training was associated with greater benefit than 10 hours, which suggests that more is better, right? And I'll come back to that in a minute. So in response to this, ACTIVE was the first large clinical trial, and the first one to really focus on outcomes beyond cognition, even though I haven't shown them to you yet, primary outcome. But what it clearly did was fuel a lot of other studies aimed at trying to find the magic bullet, the cognitive intervention that would generalize to everyday functioning. And as the corpus has grown, we see growing databases of available studies. As of yesterday, for example, this is a publicly available open source database. There are 333 articles that use a reasonable level of rigor with computer-based cognitive intervention with older adults. There have been several meta-analyses now that suggest that summarize the findings across many studies and suggest that the optimism you see in ACTIVE is actually more generally typical of the large body of findings in the field. There's a growing evidence that computerized cognitive training, which we didn't do for the most part in ACTIVE, so self-administered computerized training is effective. And we've even recently completed, a team of us at the University of Florida, a study that begins to suggest that cognitive training may also be effective for the population that I've neglected so far, people with early mild cognitive impairment, especially on some outcomes related to everyday functioning, mood, and quality of life. So what's the controversy? It's all good, right? Well, except that the primary outcome I showed you, that the whole reason we did the ACTIVE study, which was everyday functioning, I haven't shown you that yet, right? Why didn't I show that to you? What am I hiding? Well, to some extent, that's what a group of investigators brought together by the Max Planck Institute for Human Development and the Stanford Center on Longevity asked in 2014. And their critique was really with that list of commercial firms I showed you several slides back. And the fact that they were making marketing claims about the effects of brain training that were not supported by evidence, especially to the extent that those marketing claims said that brain training improved real-world functioning. They had a secondary couple of problems with the literature, which is they argued that about something called opportunity cost, which is that given how much time it would take to invest in a cognitive training program and given how narrow and specific the benefits are, wouldn't it be better to just spend your time doing something else like go for a hike? That's a direct quote from the article. That might be slightly overreaching the data, but what they wanted to argue was that the evidence for cognitive training was not yet at a point that we could make clinical recommendations to people to pursue computerized brain training. Well, another coalition of investigators neuroscientists brought together by the brain training industry, had, of course, a response to that, suggesting all the ways in which the previous review had missed important research and were throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So this argument on websites, not even in peer-reviewed journals, probably didn't ultimately answer anything. But at the same time, some other stuff was going on. You may all have read about this fine earlier in 2016, over a year ago now, that the Federal Trade Commission levied on one company for false claims related to its brain training program. Now, this was a company that got a huge amount of venture capital. They ran ads on CNN, on TV, and banner ads on every site, and that's not a problem. The problem is, again, that they made claims about people being able to perform better at work and school, reduce or delay cognitive impairment associated with age and other serious health impairment, and the evidence didn't support that. So ultimately, they came to a settlement to no longer advertise deceptively, but we begin to see a turn in the tide that the brain training industry has to have an empirical basis for what they're doing. So what's the key question? What's the controversy? The key issue of shared interest in both the Stanford statement and the rebuttal was the issue of what's called training transfer, which is exactly like what it sounds. It's the question of whether cognitive training generalizes to important real-world outcomes. And the question is whether also the generalization from cognitive training is as strong as from other intervention approaches like, say, physical exercise. So transfer of training, what's that? Wikipedia is this reliable source for everything, right? But I put it up because it's a nice, accessible little definition. Transfer of training refers to the effect that knowledge or abilities acquired in one area have on problem solving or knowledge acquisition in other areas. So it's as simple as that. And if you think about it, transfer of training is the reason for the existence of the modern formal education system, right? We don't necessarily expect that when we train you in calculus and when we train you in grammar that we care about the outcomes of calculus and grammar. What we hope we've done is provided you with skills and ways of thinking that will generalize to real-world functioning. Well, the thing is that for over a century, we have known about what's called the specificity of transfer from cognitive training. This is now considered the classic reference on this from the Psychological Review, 1901. And what they knew in 1901 is still true today, with the bottom line being that training effects tend to be narrow and specific, not general. That is, in their nature. And so I only put this up because I love the jargon of this 1901 paper. The general consideration of the cases of retention or of loss of practice effects seem to make it likely that the spread of practice occurs only where identical elements are concerned in the influencing and influenced function. So this actually became something that we call the law of identical elements. And what it means is, if you want transfer to occur, what you train needs to have a similarity, an identity, with what you want to transfer to. Sounds really basic, right? And so it's in that framework that what I'm hoping we'll do by the end of today in a few minutes is reinterpret what training effects mean. So the difficulty of achieving training transfer is a ubiquitous problem. So for example, the whole reason that we do word problems in school mathematics is because what we want to do, about two trains racing or a cashier making change, is because we want people to generalize those abstract mathematical principles that we teach them to real-world exemplars. And this isn't just true, by the way, for cognitive skill learning. Motor skill learning works the same. For example, my colleague Todd Manini compared two groups of older adults. One got traditional ACM physical resistance training, and the other group got training in tasks of daily living, carrying a heavy basket of laundry up the stairs, walking on a slippery surface, doing sort of everyday activities that involve physical challenge. And what he found out at the end of that was that the people who received traditional physical training did better on traditional physical outcome, and the people who did what he called task-specific training, tasks in the physical requirements of tasks of daily living, did better on those tasks. People get better on what you train them to do. So if you want them to get better on something, that's what you should train them on, right? It's pretty fundamental. So it's in that context, from that lens, that we sometimes have to interpret the shock and awe of a lot of this is playing out in the popular press. Here, for example, was a collaboration between a game show, or maybe a news information show on the British Broadcasting Corporation, Bang Goes the Theory, and a group of investigators in England who made available to 11,430 young to early old age adults, computerized brain training programs. And what did they find? Well, what Thorndike would have told them in 1901, that they got better on the things that they practiced on the computer, but they didn't get better in general intelligence. Okay, so we have, I think, a pretty clear pattern at this point. But the thing is, and I put this in gray because I don't want to read it all, I just want the gestalt to come from, that educational theory has told us also for more than a half century then, that if you want training to transfer, there are things you have to do. And listed in gray here are some of the things you have to do to encourage transfer. There are whole books, if you Google it, on the transfer of training. There's stuff you have to do to make it happen. And most of it's about encouraging generalization by offering generalization tasks. There are also other theories of training transfer, Salomon and Perkins in 1988, that again say that except for the most sort of rote stuff where you might be able to learn and transfer it by frequent repetition, if you want training to transfer at a deep, high-level way, you've got to train transfer. You've got to show alternative examples. You have to train for generalization. So So the other issue is that if you think about some of the figures I showed you a few slides back of the data from active, you also have to think about what transfer means in an aging population. In other words, if I train you today, do I expect generalization to real-world tasks tomorrow? Or, with older adults, do we really expect that improving your memory will quickly yield improved everyday performance? And is the goal even improvement, or is it maintenance or reduced decline? So remember I showed you this picture before? And let's take a look at our most optimistic case, the case in red. Notice that the goal here, that we're not preventing decline. What we're hoping to do is delay the period until some functional threshold is crossed. So if we think about our case here, our green case, we seem to have slowed the rate of decline, but we won't really know whether we've been effective with the person in green until the person in blue reaches some critical level of functioning that we can compare to. For example, we really don't know that this intervention worked for the person in green until their untrained peer, the person in blue, crossed the functional threshold, and that took decades. Okay? So transfer with older adults, when what you're trying to do is reverse or delay a declining process, may well be a process that involves vigilance for years. It's not an immediate payoff, and it's probably an outcome that takes longer to measure than most NIH grants allow you to follow people up for. So that's a challenge. So is there no evidence of transfer? Actually, even in the sort of most stringent ways of defining it, there is some promising evidence, and we have to think about in what context that was collected. So there's evidence that if we conceptualize transfer as reduced decline, and we're willing to wait a really long time, that we may actually see transfer to real-world outcomes that we care about, including in the active study. So this, it's again really difficult slide, but there's a gist. This is people's self-reported limitation with tasks of daily living: food preparation, medication use, financial management. Going down is bad. It means you're getting more limitations in daily activities. The group that went down the most, this what you might call burgundy line, is the group that did not receive training. The groups that went down less and that showed, after an initial similarity in trajectories, a separation of trajectories and a benefit that then seems to have lasted through the 10th annual follow-up, are all three training groups. All three training groups reported, beginning though not until 5 years after training, a separation such that they were reporting less limitations in tasks of daily living than those who received training. So it's not just self-report, because self-report has some limitations, like maybe people want to see themselves as better. One of the things that we were able to do is collect from everyone. They gave us permission to go to the archival state driving records and collect information about their motor vehicle crashes. And remember, one of our training outcomes was this visual attention thing, right? We thought it might affect driving. So the way you interpret this figure is that if nobody ever has a car crash over the next 10 years, then everyone should stay up here at 100% of people had no car crashes. So as the line goes down, people are having more and more car crashes. So the green line is having more car crashes over time than the blue line. What's the green line? The people who didn't receive training. What's the blue line? The people who did receive training. This is actually a fairly substantial separation of lines, so that by 10 years, people who received speed training and reasoning training were showing a 50% reduction in motor vehicle crash rates as identified in the archival driving records. Okay? There was a similar finding related to self-reported driving cessation. People who received training also reported lower rates of driving cessation. So this is sort of interesting to us because it's the first non-self-reported outcome that has functional practical value, and lo and behold, it took 120 months for us to accrue enough cases to see it. All right? A case for very long-term follow-up. So what's the way forward? So I'm going to argue that there are 5 ways forward for this field, building on some of what we have. And let me talk about each of them individually. So the first is, of course, to improve the design of training studies. One of the things, even in our own work that you've already heard me say, is that we had a no-contact control group. We didn't have a placebo group. But placebos in cognitive training are probably more important than we give them credit for. Because what placebos constitute in cognitive training are educational interventions or other engaging interventions that people perceive as real and meaningful, but that aren't training the critical target. And why is that important? Because to the extent that some of these reports of feeling less limited in daily activities and so forth reflects sort of mood benefits, you need a plausible placebo control to control for. So this group, Simons et al., published a really comprehensive, like a 150-page monograph on the review of current brain training programs and the quality of evidence for them and sort of shortcomings. And they led to the conclusion that, based on this examination, we find extensive evidence that brain training intervention improve performance on trained tasks, less evidence that such interventions improve performance on closely related tasks, and little evidence that training enhances performance on distantly related tasks or that training improves everyday cognitive performance. They also made a series of recommendations for the improvement of future cognitive training trials. And a lot of these are sort of generic. They're things that would make any kind of trial better. So but what it reflects, I think, is the fact that the cognitive training literature didn't come from a clinical trials background. It came from applied psychological, cognitive psychological, and neuroscience work. And it really has been this proof of concept idea. And as we evolve forward and we do more clinical trials, we've got to engage more and more in good trial practice and in having good placebo controls. The other issue is that a lot of the studies are being conducted by people who also design the training. So there's a desire to have people more consistently and properly acknowledge conflict of interest. So another systematic review of this literature was commissioned by the National Institute on Aging and conducted for the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality in October. And they were looking at this research from a different lens. Is there any evidence that cognitive training, physical exercise, nutritional intervention, are any of them at a level where we begin to believe they're useful for preventing dementia and cognitive impairment? And what these folks concluded was that of those categories of evidence, the cognitive training research was at the best level, which they still characterized as moderate quality of evidence, but that even the cognitive training literature was not yet at a point where they could make any recommendations that it was useful for the prevention of dementia and cognitive decline. They had multiple concerns about multiple areas of research, but with regard to cognitive training, they focused on two key concerns. One was about selective attrition in long-term studies. This is the idea that, for example, in the active study, by the 10th annual follow-up, something like 40% of our sample had died. So they argued that the sample we were left with to make claims about it 10 years was a positively selected, healthier subsample. But they died, right? So this is the dilemma. It's attrition, but it's attrition that's representative of what's going on in the population. So it's not that we failed to get them back. It's that the population becomes increasingly selective. But that's, as those of you who work with longitudinal studies know, that's a sort of a methodological challenge for us to think about whether the long-term benefits that we see with training are true of the population or true of the selective subgroup that survives to come to the 10th annual follow-up. And that's a legitimate methodological question. The other issue is, again, this limited transfer concern, which they characterized as concerns about the limited diffusion of effects. That was their word. So how can we improve the design of cognitive training? I take you back to the active conceptual model, and if you'll humor me for 1 minute with sort of a statistical point. Even though this number won't mean anything to you, if we somehow assume that we can characterize the strength of relationship between cognitive training and the cognitive abilities that they're meant to improve as 0.5, and accept for me for a minute that that's like a good moderate number. And if we accept that the relationship between cognitive abilities and daily functioning is 0.5, a good moderate number, then the rule of indirect effects says that we can expect a weak effect of cognitive training on the distal outcome of daily functioning of 0.25. Okay? Some simple mathematics. But now, if we look at some of the effect sizes that have been reported in the literature, the effect size of training on cognitive abilities is often closer to 0.2. The relationship between cognitive abilities and daily functioning is often 0.2. And so the indirect effect multiplies out to 0.04. So what that suggests, though, is a potential route to getting towards better cognitive intervention trials, which is to design interventions that have stronger effects and to make sure that we have better concordance between the cognitive abilities we measure and the daily functioning that we want to assess. A number of you are assessment experts doing nationally recognized work on measurement of functioning. You're the ones we need to bring into this to make sure that our assessments track well and adequately reflect the cognitive abilities that we're training. Now, what about this? How can we make this stronger? There are lots of good ideas. One of the things I want to say before that, though, is that it seems important, if you accept the example I gave before, if I want to improve face name memory, I should train face name memory, is a reconceptualization of what cognitive training is and does. And you'll notice that I've highlighted this label spot training. And in my view, a better way to think about what cognitive training can do for older adults is to treat it as the focal improvement of defined skills in which a desire for improvement has been identified. So if you want to remember people's names when you see their faces, then that's what you should be trained in. And if you get face name training, that will improve your ability in that domain and probably your well-being, but it's not necessarily going to make you better at your taxes. And I shouldn't really have that expectation, because what I want to do is begin to develop a culture of identifying areas where people might benefit from improvement and then providing them with intervention in the areas in which I have identified need. So, one of the rationales for computer and home-based training is the idea of extending doses. And if you think about it, that 0.2 effect size I showed you, there's no better way to make that number bigger than to continue intervening. That actually gets to the question you asked before. All our evidence does suggest that more is better. But we've had these 10-hour training programs. So what if we could actually provide higher dosages? That's one of the things that makes the idea of computer and home-based brain training really attractive. In fact, when you think about the durability of our active findings, it's actually remarkable when you think about how little we demanded of participants. What do I mean by that? So nobody says, here are 10 hours of physical exercise, then stop, right? In active, over a 5-year period, participants spent a maximum of 900 minutes in training. That represents just 1.8% of the available time in that 5-week period. And over the next 10-year period, even when people got up to 18 hours of training with booster, they spent a total of 0.0033 in training. Okay? So education, rehabilitation science, and physical exercise science all tell us that dosages need to be continuous, ongoing, protracted, and embedded in everyday life, and that study hasn't been done yet with cognitive training. Just practicing, though, may not be good. So here's a study Jason Allaire and I did, and the difference between the green line and the blue line is that the green line practiced this test called letter series 120 times over 2 months. 120 times. They were good souls, right, to do it that often. And the blue line didn't practice it. They came in for a pre-test and they came in for a post-test. Big, obviously, practice effect from practicing something 120 times. We then assessed these same groups of people on the letter sets test, very closely related to the letter series. Slightly different reasoning operations, but correlation typically 0.7, 0.8. You see no benefit of the green group. They spent 120 sessions improving on letter series, got a big benefit. No generalization to a closely related task. This is even narrower transfer than what's reported in training studies. So it suggests just practicing isn't the thing to do, because then you might become over-crystallized in one narrow skill. You get really good at something very specific. So what we need to do is have training that emphasizes broader skills, that's adaptive, ever more challenging in difficulty. There there have been lots of attempts, and I'm literally just going to show you some titles now, of attempts to situate cognitive training in real-world contexts that might make it broader. For example, Helga Neuss and colleagues, to improve memory in older adults, had them engage in a theater group and learn lines. Jennifer Bugos took people who never had any musical history and taught them to play piano. And in the process, she improved their verbal fluency, how many words they could generate. She improved their processing speed, because the piano, of course, emphasized all those skills, but in a highly contextualized real-world way. Elizabeth Stein-Morrow and colleagues had people engage in a version of a high school team sport for cognition, intellectual team sport called Odyssey of the Mind. They called it Senior Odyssey, and people had to get together in teams and compete on problems. And what they reported was that they had to do things like solve problems from literature, science, or build a structure out of balsa wood. And again, what they reported was improvement in a variety of measures of reasoning, processing speed. Green and Bavayer found in undergraduates that having people play 10 hours of action video games, the kind, where you hunt them and shoot them and kill them, improved useful field of view, that thing we talked about in the active study, after just 10 hours. Now, this was in undergraduates. So, and Basak, Boot, Voss, and Kramer showed that a much more complex game called Rise of Nation improved a wide variety of cognitive functions in older adults. Patricia Belchior and I replicated the video game study with older adults and found something really interesting. We compared useful field of view computer training to a video game that in young adults is not effective for improving useful field of view, Tetris, to a much more challenging video game that is effective in young adults, Medal of Honor. And what we found in older adults was that relative to people who received no training, all three of them improved useful field of view, because even Tetris was novel and challenging to our older adults participants. In another study, what we've done is compared playing a road-based video game, because we thought that might have relevance again to useful field of view, to a computer-based program for improving useful field of view. And in that study so far, our evidence suggests that the computer game is more effective than a video game. But that's actually beginning to respond to the methodological critiques of Simon and others, because this is now an active placebo control. They're fully engaged, they're doing all kinds of stuff, and in that context, we can now say that we get better outcomes from a dedicated training program designed to improve useful field of view. Training dosages clearly need to be adequate for transfer. So what we need to think about is not only expanding training dosages, but here's the promise of functional magnetic imaging. We can now increasingly identify those brain regions that are activated by a particular task, and we can take a look at whether as a function of training there are changes in the activation pattern, both in those brain regions and supporting one, and we can begin to have some additional neuroscience support for something we don't actually know right now, which is why these training programs work. We have to continue to expand the focus on outcomes beyond cognition. This is from our meta-analysis, and we showed benefits of cognitive training in cognitively impaired people on measures of self-reported function, mood, quality of life, and metacognition. And in the active study, Fred Walensky has reported over multiple manuscripts that people who received training did better than people who didn't receive training in the sense of control over their own lives, in their subjective health, in their depression symptoms, and in their health-related quality of life. So there seem to be these secondary, softer outcomes that also respond well to cognitive training. And lastly, clearly, if we want to get that 0.2 higher, we want to strengthen cognitive effect sizes, what we have to think about is augmenting cognitive training. And it's fair to say that the lion's share of next-generation cognitive research being done now is focused on this topic, whether it's extending dosages by doing home-based training over many months, by combining exercise and with executive control training, by incorporating people to be more focused before they begin the practice of cognitive training with mindfulness. We're doing a mindfulness and attentional control study right now. The other thing that we're about to start is a large NIH 3-site trial looking at another way of augmenting cognitive training, which is to increase plasticity potential by pairing cognitive training with something called transcranial direct current stimulation, which is an FDA-approved way of achieving a number of outcomes. Some studies have shown cognitive improvement. There's also evidence that it improves mood. We think improving mood may be one route to improving cognition. So, and it's fair to say that a lot of research is now focused in this direction about trying to expand the strength of cognitive training effects. The thing about computer-based adaptive training that is why I don't want things like the Stanford statement to throw the baby out with the bathwater, is that they allow us to train multiple things, they allow us to train each at their baseline level and then adaptively ramp up. And they will eventually enable us to bring in complex real-world tasks that require the coordination of multiple trained abilities. And so I think technology will continue to help us in this area. In summary, cognitive training interventions with healthy older adults have had substantial and durable effects on the targets of training. Evidence of transfer has been more limited so far, but so have the dosages and training programs, and that's clearly where the next generation is going to go. And I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
UTMB Health, working together to work wonders.